This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. All this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and joining me is the very important, significant, critical to our operations, Clara Cook. How are you, Clara?
I'm good, Duncan. Thank you. I'm hoping to survive to the end of this podcast.
Yeah, me too. That's why it's absolutely essential that this podcast just could not happen without us. So we're not in any way dispensable or disposable. If one of us goes, then that's it, listeners. So hopefully we'll make it through to the end of the recording anyway. Yeah. The topic, listeners, that we're talking about today, as you might have deduced from that, is redshirts. We're looking at the kind of trope of the red shirt within Star Trek. We're actually, oddly, not going to talk that much about actual redshirts, I'd say, insofar as we're not really going to be looking at the original series and the red-shirted characters who died various horrific deaths in that series. If you are interested in that topic, there was a great episode of Standard Orbit a couple of months ago where they looked sort of episode by episode at all the redshirts who met their horrific and grisly ends. But we're sort of taking it for granted for this episode, for the purposes of this episode, that we sort of understand that certainly after the original series went off the air, possibly before that, I don't even know when people started noticing this kind of trope, but that for the rest of the history of Star Trek, there's been a kind of awareness that there is this thing that we call the red shirt trope, that there are certain people who seem to be destined to meet a rather sudden and abrupt end, and that this is something that we can kind of talk about and examine, and indeed something that Star Trek has talked about and examined and kind of deconstructed itself. So we're really going to be looking at not so much the original series, but the later series and how they kind of engage with that trope. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about a novel called Redshirts, which is a novel by John Scalzi, which sort of takes the kind of cultural idea of the red shirt and really flips it on its head in a way. Clara, do you want to give our listeners a little bit of an idea about what that novel's all about?
Yeah, so it's a novel that starts out with the main character boarding a starship, and it is a lot like Star Trek. So there is a Federation, although it's not called the Federation. Everything is exactly like you would find in a Star Trek universe, but it's all named differently. And the main character is called Dal, and he has a backstory, which is and they spent quite a lot of time in the beginning of the novel explaining his backstory to the point where I was like, why do we need so much backstory? But now I realize why. And he makes some friends as he boards the ship. And they're actually new crew members to this ship, which is called the Intrepid. As you well know, the Intrepid is obviously a ship in Star Trek that meets a grisly end. So I think that must have been some sort of little in-joke there. And they start to notice that more and more people are dying on away missions, and that the percentage of people dying on away missions on the Intrepid is higher than any other ship in the fleet. And just that the superiors are going on these ridiculous away missions that are incredibly dangerous, that don't really seem to have much of a purpose, and that every time the superiors come by the sort of science labs, everybody hides in a cupboard. People go off for a coffee break. There's this sort of Yeti-like character who's hiding in the bowels of the ship to try and avoid being spotted by any of the bridge crew. There's this idea that if you actually ever get summoned to the bridge and you end up on the bridge, that you're probably going to die sometime in the future. And they start to realize that there's a pattern, basically, which is that there seems to be a narrative, and the narrative seems to sort of take a strange turn every once in a while. There seems to be some ridiculous away mission, and they're called on it. They'll be on it for some strange reason, and then they'll end up dying, basically, in actually quite horrible ways. Like, a lot of the deaths are quite gruesome in the book.
Including death by alien badgers. That's one of the more interesting ones that comes up. And an exploding head. Yeah, they're quite kind of gruesome. I mean, it's definitely... It's sort of original series at its campest Star Trek. I think that it's kind of...
Yeah, it's a parody. Yeah.
And what they discover, basically, in the end, these characters... So we're sort of following, essentially, the redshirt characters. We're following the kind of low-level, like the ensigns on the ship. Is they realise that there is this kind of narrative going on. They realise that events are controlled by something kind of outside of their understanding of the universe and causality and so on. And what this one character, Jenkins, discovers is that the closest analogue to the experiences that they're going through on a daily basis are old episodes of Star Trek, which he manages to dig out. And he actually shows them, look, this is what happens in Star Trek. You know, they go to a different planet, they beam down, the captain, the senior bridge crew all beam down into danger, but nothing bad ever happens to any of them. Apart from, there's one character called Kerensky, who I think is meant to be a bit of a Chekhov.
It's a Chekhov,
who kind of gets beaten up or he gets injured, but he's always basically okay. But then always one or two of the junior characters ends up dying. And they realise basically that the only logical interpretation of what's happening is that they're in a TV show, or at least that they're not in a TV show, but that the way the book presents it is that their reality is sort of impinged on by the narrative of a TV show. And so they have these moments where kind of characters go from being just behaving like themselves in real life as sort of autonomous beings to sort of acting in a kind of heroic, dramatic TV show fashion. And towards the end of the book, they end up coming into the real world, into our world, and they discover that they are in this TV show. It's actually not Star Trek. It's a kind of crappy knockoff of Star Trek that's been running in the present day, but very much kind of following that sort of formula. And so then the rest of the novel is about whether they can sort of escape their fated deaths as these kind of minor characters and realise that, they can have their own autonomy and their own real lives. But it's quite an interesting novel. I mean, it's a comic novel. It's quite enjoyable. It's a good sort of romp, but it also raises a lot of interesting questions about the way that those kind of redshirt characters are used in Star Trek, and elsewhere in fiction and drama of various kinds, what function their deaths serve, because there's a big question in the novel about, some of them say at various points, we don't mind dying, but we want our deaths to mean something. And it feels like these deaths are trivial. They're kind of abrupt. They're out of the blue. They're kind of pointless. And basically, they're just a cheap way of sort of raising the stakes in a scene, of demonstrating that the enemy or whatever is dangerous and might kill people. But the deaths themselves don't really achieve anything. And it's kind of interesting when we think about the way that Star Trek engages with these questions, because it made me think very much of the character of Tasha Yar, because Tasha Yar is a character who we see, well, we don't see it the second time, but we assume that we see her die twice. We see her die this kind of pointless redshirt death first in Skin of Evil, and then we see her in Yesterday's Enterprise go and get the kind of heroic death that's going to mean something. And there's a scene in the novel Redshirts where one of the characters basically says the same thing. I don't mind dying, but I want to die saving someone else's life, or I want to die saving the crew. I want something meaningful to happen as a result of it. I want it to be a kind of heroic sacrifice. I don't just want to be a kind of, this week this guy had to die, and next week it'll be her, and then it'll be the guy over there, and so on. And every week they're killing people off at this kind of, in this rather callous, kind of meaningless way. So the novel sort of deconstructs the idea of the red shirt very much by forcing you to sympathise with the people in that situation and actually see the kind of horror of it existentially from their point of view when they become aware of it. And there are there's quite a funny scene where they're all talking about the kind of ramifications of this, and one of them says, if we were all stoned and just talking about this in theory, this would be quite interesting and entertaining, but we're all going to die imminently, and this is really pretty grim and awful. So it's interesting in that it sort of makes you, I suppose, on one level what it does is it makes you take those people seriously, and it makes you take their lives seriously in a way that I suppose Star Trek doesn't initially. Certainly in the original series, I don't think there's all that much. There's drama around the death of each redshirt, but there's not all that much pathos. There's maybe a bit of guilt for the captain, but then it becomes all about the captain's emotions, and it becomes all about, the redshirt dies so the captain can feel guilty or feel they've made an error or something. But I suppose what that novel does, and what also some of these later episodes of Star Trek start to do, is really dig a little bit deeper into the idea that these are, in the story of Star Trek, there are these ships, yes, there's like 7 or 8 people on the bridge who we get to see every week, but actually everyone working on that ship has a life, has a story, has a kind of experience of the world and the universe that is kind of valuable in its own way, and that actually we can almost enhance the kind of overall, the bigger picture by by looking at that. And the obvious example is Lower Decks, the Next Generation episode, which, you know, aside from being a fantastic piece of drama, a brilliant, you know, sort of one-line pitch, essentially, like, let's find out what, you know, who all these random people are, basically who the extras are, you know, bring the extras to the front stage, in a sense, and give them proper storylines. But it's also very much a kind of deconstruction of the trope of the redshirt, because, you know, the idea of the redshirt is the person who they have no real backstory, we don't really know anything about them, and they just turn up and they die suddenly, and you know they're going to die from the moment you meet them. Obviously, in Lower Decks, you know, we get to know them quite well. It feels like we get to know them, and therefore that they're safe, because there's this sort of sense that once you are familiar with a character, once they're kind of part of the story, once they're part of the narrative, as Scalzi would call it, they're almost protected by the narrative, in a sense, unless they're going to die really heroically or whatever. And then, of course, what happens at the end of that episode, spoilers, if you haven't seen Lower Decks, turn off your MP3 device and go and watch it now. You know, Ensign Cito dies off screen, very suddenly, very brutally. You know, we don't even really know that much about it. And it's a real shock. It's a real kind of gut punch, because we've got to know her. We sort of feel like by that point she should be protected from this kind of red shirt curse or whatever it is. Obviously, she's a, you know, mustard shirt or whatever. It could be a big next
mustard shirt.
But she doesn't. She's as disposable as the rest of them, and she meets her fate. And then, you know, we have Captain Picard making this announcement, fraught with, you know, the weight and emotion of it all, and suddenly for once it kind of means something to us, because we know this was someone who had a life, who had dreams for the future, who had a career ahead of her, all of that sort of thing. So that's why I sort of think that Lower Depths episode is such an interesting take on the red shirt trope, because it really deconstructs it and also sort of humanizes it at the same time.
Yeah, she does have quite a meaningful death as well, though, I think. Like, her death does mean something. Like, she's trying to...
But she doesn't achieve anything. It fails.
It fails. It's a failure,
fails,
yeah.
you know?
I guess it's maybe the intention of what she's trying to do that is actually honourable. And also her death has an impact on her friends. And so that's quite important. I feel like the red shirt trope has changed over the years. And I think in the original series it was very much, you know, to illustrate immediate peril. You know, so they wanted to show how dangerous the situation was for Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, but they don't want to kill off Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, so they're going to kill off the red shirt.
Yeah.
It was also, I think, to sort of, I mean, mainly, I suppose, to illustrate peril. But then after that, the red shirt trope sort of changed into becoming the death of a red shirt has some sort of impact on a main character, or sheds light on a main character's personality or a main character's storyline. And then after that, I thought that the red shirt trope kind of became even more convoluted thing, in the sense that, which actually is illustrated in the book by Scalzi, which is that you have these sort of, they're like more developed red shirts. They're like background characters, but background characters that
Featured extras.
Yeah, so the actual whole episode will be about their death. So you're going to get to know them in the episode, a little bit like Cito. You're going to get to know them, you're going to get to care about them, but ultimately the episode's going to end in their death. You're not going to see them beyond one episode. So they're like developed red shirts, if you see what I'm saying. And I think that, and then you get the situation which you get in Voyager with Carey, Joe Carey, I think? Joe Carey, yeah. Who's like a really developed red shirt, because he's seen in several episodes, and you actually have like background information about his family, and then he dies.
Yeah.
And I was kind of upset by his death, actually. I found that quite difficult, like, because isn't he right before, like, sort of like in scenes before that, talking to Tom Paris about becoming a father, and the sort of
probably
bonding.
He's making his model ship, and you know, it's probably just the fact that he's been around for so long. I think that he's really kind of part of the furniture.
And then
he's kind of a familiar character,
but he's not important enough a main character to keep alive. That's the point, I suppose.
But it is an interesting decision in that episode that he, again, you know, like Tasha in Skin of Evil, he gets the red shirt death, not the kind of traditional heroic. You know, if they were going to kill off one of the main cast, they would, or even one of the kind of sort of larger recurring characters, they would kill them off in a more dramatic way. And maybe Skin of Evil really is the first episode in Star Trek history where the red shirt trope is kind of sort of almost analysed in a sense, because that is a very strange episode in a way, in that you want to get rid of one of your main cast members, you want to kill them off. And this is something that happens elsewhere in Star Trek, obviously, where characters die tragically, and that's the last we see of them. But the way that it's done, it's very much schematically, it's a sort of perfect red shirt moment. You know, the crew, the away team beams down. There isn't any other security personnel. Tasha's the only security personnel there. And literally 10 minutes into the episode, she's dead. And it's the fact that they do it right at the beginning. If it led up to it, if it led all the way through, then it would feel more like it was sort of her story. And
it's just to illustrate danger.
It's just like, exactly. And it's so random. It's so unexpected. Every time you watch it, I think that episode, it comes as a bit of a shock how quickly it is. Literally within the first 10 minutes, Tasha's dead. And then the episode continues without her. And everyone, yes, there's sort of an awareness about her death. And in the final kind of 5 minutes of the episode, we get that funeral scene where she's almost sort of, I was going to say redeemed. She's almost sort of re-characterized as a main character who gets to have a story and gets to sort of give a speech and do the kind of whole farewell thing. But, for the majority of the episode, she's just, Tasha's dead. Yeah, that's awful. Right, move on. We've got to focus on this. We've got to focus on that. It's about, everyone has to get on with their job and kind of almost not let that determine the whole course of the episode somehow. They've got to deal with the problem at hand.
See, I would argue that Tasha's death is very similar to Culber's and Jadzia's. So one of the things that I think I didn't like about Culber's death or Jadzia's is that they aren't redshirts. They're characters. They're main characters. And they have a huge established, well, not Culber as much, but Jadzia has, massive amounts of screen time, storylines surrounding her, like whole relationships with everybody else. And Culber has a fair amount of background information, and dialogue and everything, but they're killed in a very red shirt way. Is the death a red shirt death? So there's two different things. It's like the death is a red shirt death, but the characters aren't red shirts, or the red shirts are red shirts characters, but their deaths aren't red shirt deaths. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, I think it's
like you can mix the two.
It can go either way. And I mean, the other episode that I think is worth thinking about in terms of Deep Space Nine is the ship, where you've got a character who is very much a red shirt, Munez. But again, he's shot quite early on, but he takes almost the entire episode to die.
A developed death,
he's developed to the extent that we know he has a relationship with O'Brien, and we have seen him in a few other episodes. I think he's kind of cropped up in sort of in the background. I had a line or two or whatever. So they've sort of seeded that. But then also it's the fact that the whole episode sort of comes to be about his death, and his death sort of frames the whole episode somehow. And the fact that he doesn't just, like Tasha, sort of keel over and die instantly. He kind of is, clinging on to life throughout up until, almost the end of the episode. And then even after he dies, we have that, first of all, we have Sisko kind of struggling to deal with the loss of, I think there are 5 of them who've been killed. That's the weird thing. He's like the featured red shirt. I was talking about the featured extra. There's 4 other red shirts who've died and no one really knows anything about them or cares.
No one cares.
But he sort of stands in for them. But then at the end, you've got that nice scene with O'Brien and Worf kind of sitting by his, by his grave, by his coffin, basically, and sort of, again, giving him that kind of respect and that kind of significance and sort of meaning that typically a red shirt is denied. But you're right, with Jadzia, what you get is a very shocking sudden death, not in the course of her duty, not doing something heroic. I mean, when I say about it being random, I suppose the ultimate of the other kind of death would be Spock. When Spock dies in the Wrath of Khan, it's heroic, it's brave, it's meaningful, it's going to change the course of the entire story. He saves the entire ship, he saves all of his crew. His death is absolutely worth something. Whereas, the typical red shirt death, it's meaningless. And I suppose that's the thing that's kind of very upsetting about Jadzia's death, is that she's just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And even Ducat, I think, says later on, doesn't he? He makes some kind of remark about it, that, he was kind of unfortunate he had to kill her. She just happened to be there. But at the same time, I think the way that episode is structured, there is at least an arc to it, insofar as there's this whole thing about...
She does have some last words, doesn't she? First of all, she gets the last words off, so she gets to seemingly die, but then speak a few lines to say goodbye. She struggles on,
So she gets that, which is a bit like Tasha gets her kind of beyond the grave last words.
Yeah.
But she also gets the kind of sense of a shape to the death, because there's this whole thing about, can she and Worf have a baby or not? Yeah. And she's getting to the point where, she's willing to kind of pray to the prophets and kind of engage with the kind of spiritual side of things, which she's always been extremely resistant to up to that point in the series. She's always said, they're aliens, they're not prophets, this is all a load of rubbish. But because she wants to have that baby, she's willing to kind of go and put herself in that situation. And there's the kind of tragedy of it, that they get the message from Bashir that they are able to have a baby, and then she goes and dies. So, yes, she dies in a kind of red-shirty way, but at the same time, it's in the context of a storyline which makes that tragic rather than
it's more tragic than random.
It's more tragic because not only is it tragic that she's a main character, but it's also that they built it up. It's at the moment of greatest kind of happiness almost that suddenly it's all taken away at the last minute. So, yes, they're going to have this family, they're going to have, they're going to be together and have children and everything, and then suddenly she's taken away. So it kind of, rips that away from them. But so I think there's definitely an element of, in these kind of later Star Trek episodes, of being able to sort of vary the kind of terms of what it means to be a redshirt, what it means to die like a redshirt. But I think you're right, definitely. Joe Carey is an example of a recurring character who dies like a redshirt, and it is a shock. And they do talk about it in the episode. I mean, Chakotay and Janeway have a little sort of moment about talking about him and so on. But definitely it registers as a shock. And I suppose there's kind of a question of, you said that these characters in the original series, they're there to die to kind of up the stakes or to kind of emphasise the peril. There's also a question of do they die just to affect one of our main characters? Do you know what I mean? Are they just there to kind of so that their death can sort of traumatise someone else? And another episode that is quite interesting in this respect is the Enterprise episode, The Forgotten, which is all about Trip having to write this letter for one of his kind of junior crewmen who's died, again quite randomly in an engagement, and she was very young and it was sort of unexpected and so on. And it's quite an interesting episode because on the one hand it's sort of putting the focus on the redshirt, on the tragedy of the redshirt's death. We even get to meet her because she comes to him in a sort of dream or a vision or whatever, and so we sort of get to humanise her a bit. She's not just one of those however many people who were killed in that action, but at the same time there's this weird sense that for Trip, what he realises is the reason he's kind of blocked writing this letter is that he can't stop thinking about his sister. And so she's kind of come to stand in for the sister that he's lost in the Xindi attack, and he almost can't differentiate her. So on the one hand, the episode humanises the red shirt. On the other hand, it does it only to sort of say that she's really just a surrogate for someone else who's died. So she almost doesn't really matter who she really was. And even at the very end of the episode, when he does finally manage to write that letter, he's still holding a picture of his sister while he's doing it. So there's this kind of weird idea like that redshirt's death is meaningful only insofar as it relates to Trip. And I guess it ties into this idea of, criticism that a lot of people have with a lot of kind of genre, TV or other kind of media, is this idea of fridging, the idea that you kill a character in order to for the impact it has on someone else. And typically you kill a female character for the impact it has on her partner, who will then go on a kind of, revenge-filled spree and write injustices and so on because his dear wife or girlfriend has been killed. And it's obviously something that I think a lot of people had an anxiety about when you talked about the death of Culber being very sudden, that there was there a sort of element of that? Was it all about affecting Stamets and kind of the impact on him, and almost sort of disregarding the fact that Culber was a character that people had grown to like in his own right? Although
we don't have much of a idea of the reaction that it's had on Stamets. We see one scene where he appears to be slightly upset. I mean, I don't think they've really explored that. They could explore that more.
Definitely they could. Yeah.
I also feel like the whole thing with Trip being able to understand the death of a female crew member because his sister died is a little bit like when you hear men sometimes, normally on the internet, say, I believe in women's rights because I had a mother and I have a sister, and it's like,
It's never I had a mother, it's always because I've got a daughter.
I've got a daughter, yeah.
I've got a daughter, so now I care about women.
Yeah, and it's like, well, you should care about women because they're human beings, like you're a human being. I think it's that idea that you've got to have experience of something in order to empathize with it. I mean, and that's ridiculous. I mean, we can not have, I don't have children, but I fully support, shared parental leave because I understand it's important for everybody. So, I mean, you can not be a person of color, but you can understand that racism can, really affect people's lives. I mean, I think that it sort of cheapens the death of the red shirt, and it sort of cheapens his condolence letter to her parents or her family. I also feel that it's also really obvious to me the entire time that he's suffering from the death of his sister, and the idea, I guess they just must not have really been in touch with their emotions or in touch with like the idea of like mental health and PTSD back in Star Trek Enterprise. I say back. It's in the future. You know, I mean, a massive attack like that on Earth and losing a family member. I just thought they'd be more emotionally intelligent, but that's just me. I think that
there's no counselor on board.
There's no counselor. You're right.
To take one.
And Phlox isn't the best counselor, perhaps. I actually think that the deaths of the Redshirts in Discovery are actually more upsetting. And I think they have more meaning to them. I mean, they can be quite random. There's that crew member that dies while Burnham is in the brig right at the beginning of Discovery.
And that's upsetting. We thought he was going to be a regular, didn't we? And he was all the publicity and everything. You know, he was at the convention, he was in all the pictures and everything. And that was very much like obviously there was a suspicion that Michelle Yeoh was not going to be around like for every episode, and that therefore it was quite likely she was going to die in the premiere. But he was absolutely someone that we thought was going to be part of the crew, and then suddenly he's dead. But that was quite effective in a way, because it did sort of subvert your expectations. It was a genuine shock.
Yeah, and also it's upsetting because he's disorientated and frightened right before he dies. And same with Michelle Yeoh's character, same with Captain Georgiou. I mean, she dies in a horrible way.
Yeah.
You know, and I guess this whole researching for this whole podcast made me think about death in Star Trek generally, and I there is something to be said for this heroic death, you know, this meaningful death that you give a character where they have they have their last words, they get to say goodbye to their loved ones, they've saved the ship or the station or whatever they've done. But actually, death in real life doesn't always work that way. Death it's actually quite hard to have a good death. In fact, a lot of people don't die good deaths. And so perhaps maybe, in a way, one of the reasons why Redshirts is such a trope and why perhaps maybe it upsets people but also disturbs people recognize it, is because people want meaningful deaths from characters in television shows to sort of reassure them that death isn't such a frightening thing, and they themselves are not going to have terrible deaths. And I think in examples of modern television that we have now, like, you know, I mean, when we were talking about this podcast before doing it, you mentioned stuff like The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, and there's some pretty meaningless deaths in Game of Thrones, some pretty awful meaningless deaths of innocent people in Game of Thrones. And The Walking Dead, I mean, the deaths are just barbaric, aren't they? So, whereas you compare that with something like Lord of the Rings, where everyone gets a very long speech before they die. You think about Boromir's death, you know, he has this like long thing, and there's it's tragic, but
it's heroic.
It's heroic. It's an epic, yeah. And I think we want a meaningful death, and so I think that's why the redshirt trope kind of upsets us. And I think that Voyager tried to address that issue of meaningless redshirt deaths with having in Ashes to Ashes an actual redshirt coming back to life and confronting the captain for sending her on a mission, which she doesn't even say to Janeway. What's her name? Ensign
Lindsay Ballard.
Lindsay Ballard. And she actually says to Janeway, doesn't she, like, why didn't you send one of someone else? And she mentions like Tuvok or B'Elanna, and I like, why didn't you send them? Is it because you're close to them? Is it because you care about them? And Janeway doesn't really actually answer her. Janeway says something like, you know, well, I'm, you know, I can understand why you might be angry with me or something, but she doesn't really address the question. And you sort of wonder, is that because she doesn't want Tuvok or B'Elanna? She cares more about them because they are actual permanent, like, main characters. And as well, also the episode Latent Image, which is the one that we've discussed a lot, actually, that the Doctor has to make a choice between saving Harry Kim or this, I think it's Ensign Jetal, who is like this person that we've literally just met. In fact, we don't even meet her because it's all like...
She's already dead.
She's already dead. It's the Doctor's memories. And
same with Lindsay Ballard.
Same with Lindsay Ballard. Yeah, that's true, yeah. And so he's sort of torn, going back over and over and over about the choice that he made to save one rather than the other. And like in the novel Redshirts, there's so many things in these episodes that don't make any sense. In the novel Redshirts, the main characters, the actual Redshirts themselves, not the main characters, but the main characters of the book, not the main characters of the safe, for instance, the Intrepid, the Redshirts, are wondering, like, why is it that he's ordering me to do this? This is really stupid. Or why are we even on this planet? Or why have we gone around this corner? And the Redshirts themselves find themselves making silly decisions that they're like, while they're making them, like, why am I doing this? Why am I running away from this thing that's going to kill me? Like, why am I not hiding? And in Latent Image, you know, for the narrative, there are only two people who can perform this procedure to save either, you know, Harry Kim, or Ensign Jetal. And why are there no other doctors and no other medics on a ship the size of Voyager? You know, I mean, the Doctor himself makes strange decisions, you know, and part of it is because you need for narrative purposes, you need the main characters to make dumb decisions so the Redshirts can die, and the Redshirts have to die in order for the main characters to learn something about themselves.
But it's weird, those Voyager episodes, I feel like Voyager is on this sort of strange mission to kind of, almost sort of rehabilitate these Redshirts. But the weird thing is, what I think is a shame, is they don't do it with Redshirts who we've actually ever seen. Do you know what I mean? Like, those characters they're new characters, they're newly cast for those episodes, and we're supposed to believe that they were sort of in the kind of imagined backstory of Voyager that we never saw for some reason, kind of going about their business. Whereas I think, I think it's a shame that they weren't able to use a character that we had. I mean, in a way, if the Doctor had killed Carey instead of Harry, it would have had more weight to it. Do you know what I mean? Because at least we've been like, oh, wow, Carey, okay, well, I suppose it's obvious he's going to pick Harry. And I think there's the other weird thing with that story is the Doctor's whole crisis is he can't understand why he picked Harry and not Ensign Chital. We all know that
we can
it's a complete
understand
no-brainer. Obviously, he's going to pick the main character and not the redshirt. That's how it works. Like, the Doctor clearly has never seen Star Trek, so he doesn't know, that those are kind of the rules, and he can't sort of rationalise it. So there's this weird almost sort of split personality where Voyager's sort of saying on the one hand, we understand these are the expendable characters. On the other hand, no, they're not. They're as real as everyone else, and they're as human as everyone else, and so on. But I think it's interesting when you were saying, do we find it disturbing, these redshirt deaths? I actually don't know if we do, and I think that's part of the thing about with the original series. They're generally, people find them comic, especially when you see all those like clips of like all of them edited together or something. There's something slightly,
or like memes,
kind of over the top. And even with the Next Generation, there's that quite horrific death in Where Silence Has Lease of the guy at the helm, and he's like clutching his head and collapses in the middle of the bridge and dies. I mean, it's quite horrific, but at the same time, it's so over the top and random that there is something kind of grimly comedic about it, if you know what I mean. But it's weird that we don't feel more sympathy for the Redshirts, because I suppose one of the reasons that these other stories, these kind of deconstruction stories, resonate, I think, is, of course, the Redshirts are us. I mean, if you and I were serving on the Enterprise, we probably wouldn't be up on the bridge. We probably would be, scrubbing the plasma conduit or doing some kind of
Speak for yourself.
Maybe we'd be working in the library. I don't know. But do you know what I mean? We'd be doing one of these kind of...
We'd be running like the Starship
dramatic,
like radio show.
Yeah, and that's the briefing with Neelix or whatever. But we wouldn't be, doing the heroic thing and saving the day and so on necessarily. And I think that's part of why these kind of stories appeal. And some of the comedy in Scalzi's novel, and it also reminded me a bit of the episode of Black Mirror that they did, which was a kind of Star Trek sort of a pastiche in effect, was that idea of what you don't get in Star Trek. In Star Trek, everyone's very sort of respectful of the chain of command. Even in that episode of the ship, they talk about how the 5 crewmen who died were also pleased to serve under Sisko, and how much they respected him and how proud they were to wear their uniforms and so on. Whereas in Redshirts, the novel, what you get is these people who are like openly contemptuous of their superiors, who behave in every way basically like normal people in a kind of hierarchical system do about their bosses. They think they're ridiculous. They think they didn't deserve to get the job. It's almost a kind of horrible bosses element to it. And when you get to that episode of Black Mirror, it's literally... it's a very dark spin on things, because they are these kind of disposable characters. This is a spoiler if you haven't seen that episode of Black Mirror. Go watch it if you want to.
I haven't.
Sorry, Clara. I was just
spoiling everything, man.
For Clara now. But basically, they are trapped in this scenario. The captain is the only one who's in control. He's on this kind of power trip, playing this game because he's obsessed with this kind of Star Trek-like TV show, essentially, and putting all his co-workers and so on in, basically enslaving them in the role of these kind of junior people around him, so that they can, suffer horrifically and awful things can happen to them and so on. And so that's an even sort of darker take on the idea of, these people who are the kind of the regulars almost, who are kind of protected, who are safe, the captain and the first officer and so on. And then the kind of terror of being the lowly, disposable people in a way. And we do see that a little bit in Voyager. Again, there's the episode Good Shepherd, where Janeway takes this group of misfits on an away mission, because they'd never been on one. They'd literally never left the ship before, or presumably they had shore leave or whatever, but they'd never been sent on a mission away from the ship before. And some of them are quite reluctant to go. They've got exactly that idea. This is dangerous. I'm not doing this. I'm not leaving Voyager. Delta Flyer. Exactly. Yeah, just leave me where I am. I'll mind my own business. And hopefully we'll get home in 70 odd years or whatever, and I just won't trouble anyone along the way. So there's definitely that sort of idea of that kind of awareness of that their situation is a kind of perilous one in a way. And that, I think, is interesting because that does tie into these kind of real world ideas about sort of whose lives are more in peril than others, or whose lives are more endangered than others. I mean, that episode of Enterprise, The Forgotten, with Trip writing the letter, it reminded me very much of, the First World War, all these officers writing endless letters home because of their men who'd been killed. And even the form of words that he uses, I regret to inform you that so-and-so, is that sort of classic idea of the condolence letter, which is the episode itself, again, sort of deconstructs at the end. In fact, it's a complete sham, because the person already, those letters are never informing anyone of anything. They're sort of serving a different purpose, but it's always, the officer who has to write the letter for the people under them who've died. Again, that's sort of putting the emphasis on the senior character and the kind of responsibility of command and the responsibility of losing people and so on, rather than really being about the life of the person who's died, in a sense. Whereas, maybe part of that is that we don't really want to think of ourselves as the kind of disposable, the people whose lives don't mean anything, the people who, if we die tomorrow, there's not going to be a great obituary, no one's going to notice, kind of thing. We want to sort of feel like we mean something somehow. And obviously in Star Trek, those redshirts, they don't mean very much. And, in the novel Redshirts, they're kind of realizing that they really don't mean anything, and that there are other people in their kind of periphery who are the ones that everyone is interested in, whose stories mean something, are valuable in some way.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like when you watch a disaster movie and you see a tsunami sort of go towards a city or something, and you see all these little people dying, and you think, I would be one of those people. I'm not the hero who's going to outrun the tsunami. I'm one of those people in a car that's going to get swept away. I think that in Redshirts, the novel, there is a very touching moment halfway through towards the end of the book, where Jenkins, who's the Yeti-like character who's hiding in the bowels of the ship, who's the one that really actually discovers that the whole thing is set up like a TV show. He talks about his wife. Well, actually, he doesn't. Dahl talks to him about his wife. He's trying to convince Jenkins to do something and to help them, and he talks to him about his wife. And it's clear Jenkins' wife is dead. She was redshirt, so she died. And after she died, Jenkins kind of retreated into the sort of, I guess you'd call them Jeffrey's tubes, to try and avoid being caught up in the narrative. And it's clear that Jenkins really loved his wife, and he remembers proposing to her on the front lawn of the house of her parents. And I had this mental image of a Yeti looking like alien getting down on one knee, in a sort of suburban front garden. But the idea in the book is that there is real. It's very jokey, it's very parody, but there are real lives. They're real lives and they're real people, and because perhaps their lives aren't as glorious as, say, for instance, the captains, but because they're small people doesn't mean that their lives aren't important or their lives aren't worthy. And it's the idea that just because you aren't a type A personality is going to become a leader of men, it doesn't mean that your existence isn't just as justified as that, big, famous, brilliant person that is at the top of the food chain. I think that one of the things that really struck me when I was researching for this podcast was how often Star Trek uses death as the ultimate narrative way to affect change, to create change. So some of the deaths that we're talking about, the redshirt deaths of main characters, are actually happened because the actresses or actors left the show. And so they've got to get rid of them somehow. And I've always thought it's strange, rather than transferring them out and sort of saying guys, I've decided to go work somewhere else, and it's been great knowing you, and let's message each other, let's send each other little space letters. It's always no, they've got to die in some bad way. But also it's used to split up relationships. And very typically, and I was just thinking about this in terms of Vedic Baral. Now, I felt Vedic Baral's death wasn't a redshirt death because he has this long extended death, but it's kind of a more developed redshirt death because the whole episode is about him dying. I think it's called Life Support, isn't it? Yeah. The whole episode is about him dying, and it is really tragic. Kira's reaction and Nana Visitor's acting is really brilliant in that episode, and she does seem very grief-stricken. I am not the biggest fan of Vedic Baral myself personally, but I think that, and I guess in a way, the actor probably wanted to leave I assume he wanted to leave Deep Space Nine, or maybe they wanted to develop Kira's character. I don't know why he died.
They just wanted shots of him, to be honest.
Well, they wanted shots of him, and they seem to be quite in love with each other. So it doesn't sort of ring true that she would break up with him. But in lots of, you see this again and again in lots of romantic, pairings or even friendships, somebody's has some sort of conflict and they come back together. Invariably one of them's going to die because there has to be some sort of tragedy, some sort of pathos to the story. And in a relationship, almost all romantic relationships in any sort of type of drama, not just science fiction, any TV show, almost always end in tragedy. If you think about it, no one ever kind of walks off, gets married and kind of bickers over the
Keiko got dishes lightly, really, I think.
Yeah, she did. I mean, they did pretty well, but if you think about it, most of them don't. Yeah. And I mean, even Odo and Kira, I think that's actually quite a good end to the relationship because neither of them die. They make a conscious decision to part. They part amicably. I think that was it's more realistic as it can be because he's a shapeshifter and it's sci-fi, but it's more realistic than, say, for instance, Jazia's death. Or even Cisco, ending up not dying, but kind of becoming an ethereal prophet-like, sort of timeless being. So the one that really struck me I thought was really red-shirty, although she's not a red shirt, but it's a red shirt death, is Edith Keeler. In the City of the Edge Forever. And I actually think it's good that she dies. I love that episode. I think it's really meaningful. And I think it has a real effect on Kirk. I think it has an effect on history. It's a moral dilemma for Kirk to make. Spock's involved. McCoy's involved. It's a very tragic story. It's really good. But at the same time, I was like, it's the same thing with fridging, isn't it? It's like she dies so that the three men can learn something about each other and about themselves. And Kirk can remain free so that he can kiss every other alien woman in the galaxy. So you could have the red shirt death trope is even more widespread than the actual red shirt individual trope, if you see what I'm saying.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point about Edith Keeler. I suppose the thing about Edith Keeler is the danger is that if she doesn't die, she becomes a historical figure of importance and meaning that affects the outcome of
prevents World War II
events. Exactly. So there's that weird sort of sense that she has to die precisely so that she can be obscure and forgotten and live a life that no one knows about. But you're right, absolutely. The kind of dramatic weight of it is very much, to have that impact on Captain Kirk of having to make that decision and having to lose her. And I mean, in some ways, the kind of fridging idea obviously is quite pervasive, and it is something that comes up in a lot of these stories. I mentioned the way it plays out in Forgotten. And I think the idea of fridging is sort of a tricky one because I suppose, I don't know whether it matters whether they were a character in their own right to begin with, and then they're treated like that. I think maybe that is worse. I mean, arguably, Trip's sister is a fridged character because she never existed before. I don't think he ever mentioned having a sister before we found out that she'd been killed. So, I don't know whether that is obviously the same thing insofar as it's a character who's been killed off screen for the benefit of motivating the drama for one of our lead characters. But I don't think it's quite as problematic maybe as when that happens to a character that we actually do care about some degree, or that we have kind of presented in their own right. I don't know. It's a complicated sort of issue and something to be aware of. And I suppose the issue with the fridging is it's not so much that you can't ever kill a character in a random or shocking way or whatever. I mean, say when Dr. Culber was killed, there was a real backlash in terms of this idea of, I think we talked about the kill your gaze trope and all these kind of ideas that it seemed to be tapping into. And it's not to say, you can't kill a character randomly or shockingly or whatever, but just to maybe be a little bit more aware of what the kind of meaning of that might be, or a bit more kind of to take it a little bit more seriously. And I suppose really that's what all these stories have in common in a sense is, do we take these deaths seriously or not? Or do we treat them in a kind of flippant way? And I suppose the original series approach to the Redshirts, where it is often a bit over the top and it is a bit, and the fact that it's become a kind of popular culture joke, is a meme, is a kind of joke, to the extent that, say, in the 2009 Star Trek film, there's a pretty explicit redshirt joke in there when you get Kirk, Sulu, and the chief engineer of the ship. Though I have to say, that was only when we saw that film recently at the Royal Albert Hall that I worked out that he was meant to be the chief engineer of the ship. That somehow passed me by every time I'd seen it before. But he is just like, first of all, he is literally wearing a red shirt. Secondly, he's the most obnoxious, like deserving to die a horrific death, unpleasant character you could meet. You know, in the space of about 5 seconds on screen, he annoys everyone. He makes, you know, the kind of rebooted Kirk seem really measured and reasonable, because he's, you know, first of all, he says, yeah, I'm going to get some Romulan ass or whatever. And then he's, you know, kicks some Romulan ass, but not get some. And then he's kind of cheering as they're going down on their skydiving, or whatever. He's like a real jerk, basically. And then he's just incinerated suddenly in a burst of flame in a moment that is clearly meant to be funny, you know, and it's like it's played for laughs. The comedy of this guy who was really brash and ballsy and thought he was great, just suddenly miscalculating and dying horrifically. But it is that kind of thing of like, so we can understand from the point of view of watching that film that that's funny. That's a funny scenario. This guy was, you know, too cocky and he died as a result. Obviously, in real life, that would be horrific. We wouldn't feel like that. So there is this sort of weird play of like, what are the kind of conventions of drama or TV or film or whatever, where we're willing to sort of suspend our empathy or suspend our kind of actual sort of natural response in order to kind of enjoy something. I mean, and it's not just, you know, this trope. There's, you know, if you think about, you mentioned disaster movies, there's also like horror movies have certain tropes about who's going to die when, and, you know, there's various kinds of films where we kind of, you know, yeah, it's just a story. It's just make believe. We don't really care about the people. The people are kind of disposable in some way. But it's interesting, you know, it's not so much a one-way thing where like, oh, well, now it's 2009. We wouldn't dream of doing that. We care about characters too much. We can still laugh at, you know, this guy being incinerated.
Yeah, and we don't want to make our entertainment, especially science fiction, like so dark and so dystopian that it becomes an incredibly hard, depressing slog to watch. We don't want to be so po-faced either, like that we can't enjoy some of the humour that's injected, especially like kind of cocky, kind of like sailing close to the wind type of humour or dark humour. I did feel a little bit that Joe Scalzi's book, Redshirts, was slightly mean about science fiction. The main bridge characters are seen as really pretty obnoxious. Like they don't have any redeeming characteristics, really. The captain is like this overblown, arrogant, kind of ridiculous, bad captain, you know. Kerensky is actually really seen as a bumbling idiot, you know. Yeah. Whereas, although Chekhov does have a lot of humor in the original series, and he is a humorous character, you know. He's in the reboot, he's young and he's you know, supposed to sort of seem like kind of over enthusiastic. In the original series, he's comparing everything that he comes across as being as good as, or not as good as something in Russia, or he says everything's invented in Russia. Like he's supposed to be funny. But there's also a serious element to him too. Like he's brave, he's smart. He is kind of mentored by Spock because he's supposed to be young and a genius, you know. So I did feel a little bit like the author of Redshirts was kind of going a tad too far. And there is an element of like drawing the curtain aside and showing you how the sort of machine behind, you know, like the magician kind of revealing how he's done his tricks to the point where like I don't really necessarily want to analyze every death in Star Trek. I don't really want to analyze, or obviously that's what we're doing right now. I don't really want to necessarily be thinking about every red shirt that dies and feeling guilty that I'm kind of enjoying the fact that they're dying because they should have a better, meaningful storyline.
Or even if you're not enjoying it, that you're kind of indifferent to it, I suppose, because you recognise that from a narrative point of view, it's not important. Yeah,
so in a way, I felt like I enjoyed the book a lot, and actually, I would recommend anyone listening to get the audio version because it's read by Will Wheaton, and he's actually a very good audiobook reader actor. But after a while, I was like, you know, this is a very cynical take on Star Trek, and I can tell you like Star Trek because the detail here in the book is very much something. It's very, very detailed. I can see that there's a lot of depth to it. I can see that you're a Star Trek fan. But we're getting to the point now where I'm struggling to watch Star Trek episodes afterwards because I'm starting to feel a little bit guilty every time a red shirt dies. And also kind of just like sort of seeing how stupid some of the captain's decisions are.
Yeah.
To lead to all these like deaths of crew members.
Which is kind of a theme, that idea of bad leadership, and whether or not it's the captain who's a bad leader, which is the case in that novel, the Intrepid, you know, the captain of the Intrepid is a bit of a buffoon, as you say. But also what turns out, you know, spoilers again, but in the latter part of that novel, they come to the real world and they find the executive producer and the writer, the like head writer of the kind of Star Trek knockoff show that is their reality. And the writer, once he learns that basically every time he writes a character's random death, someone actually dies in this kind of parallel universe or whatever, is completely paralyzed by it. You know, he suffers from terrible writer's block. He suffers from guilt over the fact that he's killed all these people inadvertently because he didn't know that when he writes, you know, so-and-so steps forward and a boulder falls on his head, that literally someone is dying as a result of it. So it's this weird idea of sort of, yes, on the one hand, kind of taking responsibility, forcing someone in that situation to take it seriously, someone who otherwise is a bit of a sort of flippant Hollywood writer. But also, again and again, this sort of idea of bad leadership, bad writing. And that's what they keep coming back to in the Redshirts novel is they're like, you know, you're a hack. You're writing our stories badly. We want you to take us seriously. We want you to be a better writer. We don't even mind if you have to kill us sometimes, but give us proper deaths. Treat us, you know, like real characters, basically. But it's that weird idea, the sort of idea of bad leadership, which I think is almost this kind of subversive reading of Star Trek, because Star Trek is so invested in the captain as the kind of perfect embodiment of good leadership and good command and so on. And you see it even, I mean, I sent you when we were preparing for this episode, I'm sure many of the listeners have seen it, that there's a sort of infographic that someone's made of all the different captains, sort of say how many redshirts did they kill, basically, you know, Kirk killed this many, Picard killed this many, Janeway killed that many, and so on. And what percentage of their crew actually died. And, you know, does it, if Kirk kills more redshirts than anyone else, is Kirk a bad leader because so many people appear to die on his ship? And that it's sort of a resistant reading of Star Trek in a way. Captain Kirk is a wildly irresponsible man who, you know, whose kind of death rate is just off the charts, and probably back at Starfleet Command, they're looking at it and saying, you know, he's lost another 5 this week. You know, what's going on that ship? Why are so many people dying? Which is sort of what's going on in the Redshirts novel, is they realise, the point where they realise they're part of a TV show, or their reality is impinged on by a TV show, is when they realise that statistically just far more people are dying on their ship than on any other ship in the fleet, than, you know, in any other comparable situation, that it's sort of unrealistic. But again, it comes back to this idea of, you know, it's either a bad captain, is Captain Kirk a bad captain, contrary to what Star Trek would seem to suggest, or it's bad writing or bad, you know, so someone high up is kind of failing these people on the ground.
I think some of it definitely is bad writing. I think it's only ever really a bad command decision or a bad captain or a bad leader when the story wants to make a point about bad leadership and they want a bad captain involved, you know, or a bad admiral or a bad commodore, because they're often commodores, aren't they? So I think the majority of the time it's bad writing. And I think it literally is. I mean, you've got to think about how many scripts these writers were having to churn out, you know, especially for a series that has something like, I don't know, ridiculous, like 24 episodes, you know, it's massive serialized series. And they don't really have those kind of series on television anymore, you know. So there's a lot of scripts, a lot of writing. There's got to be drama, there's got to be tension. In science fiction, writers seem very concerned with drama and tension. So things happen that just seem ridiculous, but in order to create drama. So I think sometimes it is bad writing. I think that like I was saying, the easiest, quickest way to affect change in a story is to have a death somewhere. And that's why I think so many relationships end in death for one person or another. That's why so many characters, like we talked about this in our Father's Day episode, where so many characters have dead parents or dead fathers. I honestly do think sometimes that a red shirt death for a main character or a sort of semi-established background character or an extra, or a red shirt dying in some way is bad writing. It's an easy way to show peril. It's an easy way to create drama.
There's also this sort of question, I suppose, though, about what is good writing or bad writing? What is it that makes it feel real? And
we know.
And is it necessarily, are the rules of narrative different from the rules of reality? And this is something that comes up in the novel Redshirts, because obviously they talk about this idea. They keep saying, avoid the narrative, don't get sucked into the narrative, because the narrative is the thing that kills people more than real life. But of course, there is a sort of question with reality and with writing about whether something that plays one way in real life plays differently in a narrative. You know, in narrative, we do expect things to kind of tie together. We expect some kind of structure. We expect some kind of order in a way that obviously we don't expect in real life, because we know that real life is chaotic and messy and so on. So one of the things I've been wondering is whether what we saw essentially with Dr. Culber in Discovery is the kind of the beginning of a slightly different approach to the way that deaths are treated in Star Trek. I suppose this idea that sort of everyone could be a redshirt in a sense, the idea that, no one is safe, which is definitely what you see in other shows like The Walking Dead or like Game of Thrones or these kind of long serialized shows where the death of major characters is much more a kind of feature of the ongoing drama.
Yeah, so earlier in this podcast, I basically said that I thought that death can often be quite brutal and meaningless, and that having a meaningful death, like the kind you'd find in Lord of the Rings, or that you find in Star Trek with some characters, is a little bit unrealistic. But I'm going to completely contradict myself now by saying that the problem with Game of Thrones and with The Walking Dead, but particularly with Game of Thrones, is you spend so much of your time, hours of watching television, investing in a character, and that the narrative spends so much time focusing on a character, on their motivations, their moral dilemmas, their decisions. They build these people up as if they're going to have some sort of meaningful future, and then kills them off in a way that is very brutal, very meaningless, very sudden. And so I think you feel a little bit like you wasted energy in caring about that character. You wasted your time investing attention in that character. And I know that's some of the criticisms that people I know who've watched the show have said. I spent a lot of time following Robb Stark, and then spoiler alert.
Spoilers? I've never seen Game of Thrones.
Oh my God.
I'll try and forget
I'm so sorry. I won't say anything more.
Okay.
But yeah, that's part of the problem.
It's all right, I deserve it. I've spoiled enough things for you.
So there is an element of audience frustration and audience satisfaction. So if you're a writer, it's not just about the drama, it's also about I think it's also about giving the audience satisfying entertainment. And is a red shirt death really that satisfying for a long-term developed character?
No, it's kind of like junk food, isn't it? It's like the sort of quick fix, the quick sort of treat almost, isn't it, of a bit of drama. And I suppose that's where the sort of criticism of red shirt deaths as bad drama comes in. Whereas something like, the death of Spock in the Wrath of Khan, obviously there was outrage at the idea of killing off Spock. At the same time, they did it in such a dramatic, meaningful, significant way that you kind of, as an audience, yes, you can feel kind of heartbroken that that's happened, but at the same time, you also feel satisfied at the way that it happened. And I suppose, like you said, everyone wants to have a good death. In real life, that's something that people consider in terms of pain and suffering and all these kinds of things, and dignity and so on. And in a way, it's sort of the same thing that we're talking about with these fictional characters. In a way, we want them to die heroically. We want them to die in a sort of dignified, dramatic, satisfying way, so that their story sort of feels like it has a shape to it, a creative shape, rather than the kind of messy, slightly depressing shape of many real world lives, which possibly is something that we don't really want to be reminded about, the fact that we're so insignificant and that our lives are so kind of meaningless, and that, we may well just die unexpectedly being hit by a bus or, whatever it is. It's a kind of, it's something we don't really want to engage with. The other thing that just crossed my mind about these redshirt deaths is that, I think the way that they're dealt with in the original series, there's something slightly flippant often about it, which is why they become a sort of comedic trope. That there is, even if it's not comic, there's something kind of, oh, they've just died, let's move on to the next thing. And it kind of undersells the effect, even on someone granted that Starfleet is a military organisation and therefore they probably are used to dealing with death, but that actually the presence of dead bodies for most people is quite shocking. And the more, far more so if there's someone that you knew, or even not someone that you knew, but someone that, you exchanged words with a few minutes before. And obviously these are the sort of things that people who have fought in wars and so on have had to deal with, losing their friends or losing their colleagues or whatever. But they are understandably traumatized by these things. And I suppose that's what we don't tend to see in Star Trek, is any sense of the kind of lasting impact of those sort of losses on people. There might be a kind of temporary impact. So say with Chief O'Brien in the ship, there is a real kind of emotional residual effect there. And even in Lower Decks, there's the kind of, obviously Picard and Worf, who are both in different ways sort of sympathetic to and kind of mentoring the character of Ensign Sito, definitely register that loss quite meaningfully. But at the same time, there certainly isn't that sense of kind of the real sort of visceral horror of someone that you knew, minutes before suddenly being dead, and that's it.
And death in Star Trek is very clean. And it was very clean, I think, until around about The Wrath of Khan, when, you have Scotty's nephew, who was pretty much in the original cut, is like relegated.
He's a redshirt.
It's
exactly.
a redshirt,
The editing turns him into a redshirt, which is a strange thing. Whereas, if we know he's Scotty's nephew, then kind of he has a
and in the
place in the story
extended version, he's got more of a backstory. And in the novel of The Wrath of Khan, he's got a whole backstory. He's got like a friendship with Saavik and everything. So his death is even more tragic. But yeah, I mean, Spock's death, it's not like visceral, but he's obviously suffering. And I mean, he's I think you're supposed to think towards the end, he's kind of blind. You can't really see where he's going. And he's got burns. He's had his burns on his face and his hands. And I think that in the book novelizations of the movies, Kirk's memories of Spock dying are very much of him being hideously burned. He's affected by his appearance, not just the fact that he's dead.
Yeah.
So I think that you're right. You're right. The visceralness of death has gone mostly, for a lot, from Star Trek. The actual element of people being in pain. There's no real sort of. I mean, one of the things that you find in war, especially in wars like World War One, where there wasn't the same kind of medical treatment as there is now, not the same levels of kind of like, I suppose, like in terms of medical treatment on site and drugs and everything. There's a lot of horrible pain, I mean, a lot of people in no man's land screaming and screaming and screaming for hours until they eventually die. You don't really get much of that in Star Trek either. And even Vedic Baral's death, which is pretty horrific, he just kind of loses his sense of self. He doesn't seem to be in agony. So
it's again quite clean. I mean, it's not what you also get in war is the kind of horror of bodily sort of disintegration one way or another, the kind of horror of seeing, physically people who are not as they should be. And I mean, I've never been to war, but some of our listeners probably have. But, I witnessed the aftermath of a traffic accident once where a woman had stepped into the road and been killed by a truck, I think. And she was already dead by the time I was literally just walking past going to the bank. But it really affected me. I mean, like for weeks afterwards, I was having nightmares about this because just the sight of, witnessing that really profoundly shocked me. And even now, it's the sort of like it flashes into my head if I think, so, if there's some kind of danger, if I see a large truck or something, it kind of comes back to me, that kind of idea. And, yes, obviously Starfleet people, they're trained to deal with these sorts of things. They're trained to deal with the kind of difficulties of combat and so on. But, if you read accounts of the First World War or even the Second World War, any war really, these are the kind of things that play on soldiers' minds that really affect them. The kind of horrific death that they see, which is so out of the sphere of, hospitals and kind of managed death and kind of, sort of how we expect people to die in everyday life, where there's a degree of predictability to it. It is those kind of very sudden, very violent, very shocking deaths that, they leave an impact on people. And, Star Trek's a family show. Maybe they're not going to go there too much of an extent, though I guess with Discovery they did to some extent, because the way it wasn't just the fact that Culber was killed very suddenly, it was very brutal, and the fact that they kept flashing back to it, there was an element of kind of trauma. They were almost trying to traumatize the viewer in the way that they directed it. But I mean, even if it's a family show and you can't show much gore, and I get that, I understand it, it's not Game of Thrones, it's not The Walking Dead, it's not like a horror show. I think you can explore grief, and I think you can do very good representations of grief, even grief that's family friendly. And children understand grief, like children understand love. It's like the whole idea of like, you can't show a romantic relationship between, I mean, some, so I would say sort of very close-minded viewers in parts of the world believe you can't show a romantic relationship between two people of the same sex without corrupting young minds. I mean, it's like children understand love, so, and they do understand. They may not understand death so much, but they understand grief. They understand having lost something. And there are children who have dealt with grief, because they have lost people very, very young. So I think Star Trek could explore grief more. And I think the red shirt deaths are never going to allow that. They're not grieved. They're not grieved, yeah. And to an extent, Culber's death is like that, because
I know people on the Babel conference will probably disagree with me. I know some of our listeners will disagree with me, but I really feel like his death hasn't been properly, like, grieved. Like, people haven't been grief-stricken enough over it. And I think maybe that'll be coming in season 2. Maybe it won't. But
maybe he'll be back from the dead.
Yeah, maybe back from the dead. I mean, also in Star Trek, no one really ever dies either, do they? That's also the problem. So, but there has to be an element of, I mean, even Kez, you know, I mean, I think there was some grief there, but not that much. And she didn't really die. And she kind of came back. And I think that if you're going to have death as part of a show, and you're going to have death as part of a narrative, and death as a sort of fictional device in order to create drama, then you've got to have a fallout aftermath. You've got to have the aftermath. You've got to have a fallout after it. Like, you've got to have some sort of psychological impact, because there's this thing about the idea that people learn through suffering, and through learning through suffering, they become stronger. And you see this in shows like Westworld, the repeated suffering of individuals. And very often, sometimes it can be female characters, the repeated suffering of victims, and they sort of learn through it and they become stronger. In real life, it doesn't really work that way. Sometimes when people suffer, they just suffer, and it's just awful. And they don't become stronger, better people. And I think that there's a danger that we maybe sort of trivialize people's pain in real life if we don't see it accurately reflected on screen.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, when you were talking about the kind of lasting ramifications, I mean, I suppose Jadzia's death is one where it does seem to kind of carry forward, at least to a certain extent, you know, insofar as we see the impact on Sisko. It is a real complete crisis for him. We sort of see the impact on Worf and so on. It's you know, not forgotten in the next episode, if you know what I mean. But yeah, even there, I suppose there's a kind of a shapely element to the way that the story is handled, if you know what I mean, which is maybe not how people experience grief and these kind of things in real life. Well, it's been fun talking about Redshirts and their tragic, deeply distressing demises. But this isn't the only thing we've been talking about on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to some of the other things you might have missed elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
It's a white uniform, and you're dealing with medical blood, all this other stuff, fluids.
Yeah.
That thing ain't gonna stay white. So in my head, they're treated that it just doesn't even stick. It just repels off it.
Earl Grey.
So Picard says he won't transfer anyone off the ship, but as a compromise, get ready for this. As a compromise, he will reassign Worf as Wesley's tutor.
I love that. Yes. Put some discipline in that boy.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
This is like a choice you could, I don't know. I would imagine.
Man, I really like this story
you
now.
Like it?
Yeah.
There's more later, but yeah, Worf as Wesley's tutor.
Melodic Treks.
And, I talked to the producers when I first did the show, and the first thing they had me do was take a combination of the dun-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, the Sandy Courage wonderful horn theme, and Jerry's da-da-da-da-da-da, his theme for the first movie, and make a theme out of those and combine them. So I did it electronically, and they said, good enough. And I said, look, this is not my specialty. And they said, never mind, you got it. So 18 years later, that was it.
The 602 Club.
I did definitely feel what you're saying, Matt, like it was a Bond greatest hits in that opening sequence. You've got Russians again, or supposed to be in Russia. You've got, a group of terrorists all gathering together about, all these different weapons, and you're trying to ID people, and then, we of course bring back in M, and then she's having to argue now with the government and the military, and then I like that they kind of bring in Bond in a subtle way, calling him White Knight this time. That was cool, but yeah, I think otherwise it feels very familiar, but in a great way. I feel like Arnold dealing with the music, and then the actors as well, taking good direction, made a lot of intensity in that scene. So you don't feel like you're moving into the film slowly. They're coming at you full force, and then, Bond runs off with the plane. So I really liked it.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps. And you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation at the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We are Primitive Culture and we are your hosts. My name is Clara Cook and you can find me on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC. My co-host is Duncan Barrett and you can find Duncan on Twitter at Barrett's Books. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. Now I'd like to express a big thank you to our executive producer, Amy Nelson. You can find Amy Nelson on the Earl Grey podcast on Trek FM. So thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended already.